My name's Pete Fitzgerald. I'm a digital marketing consultant at Coast Digital. Thanks for making the time to come to the webinar today. I hope you're all staying safe and well. I'm going to be talking to you today about digital marketing and COVID-19. And really, I just want to start off by talking about where we are now, essentially. I think we all know that we're living through a crisis that goes way beyond marketing. Our day-to-day lives have been massively changed, and I think it doesn't come as a massive surprise based on the huge change in circumstances that it has had a massive effect on business and marketing in general. For some organizations and some of our clients, we're seeing traffic and interest significantly down. For others, we're seeing transactions down or even to zero in some cases, where products and services can no longer be offered or supply chains have been otherwise broken. For others, it's the other way around. Some businesses are thriving in the current climate, either in their entirety or little sections of those organizations are doing really well. And what we're noticing is that in a lot of cases, that's where offerings are delivered digitally. Essentially, the digital supply chain survives while the physical supply chain is struggling. And I think the thing to bear in mind with all of this is, and I know I'm going to start talking about what we want to do now in the current situation, is there anything we do now as organizations, either to respond to this crisis or to prepare for the future? Essentially, we can now take steps to prepare for future situations like this one. And now that could be a similar situation to the one we're in now, a sort of national situation where everyone's in the same boat, or it could be a more refined crisis that affects just your sector or just your organization. And obviously we are all living through the same set of circumstances, but I think a lot of the ways we can respond to COVID-19 and the situation we find ourselves in now is actually going to help us to respond to future crises that might occur on a smaller scale. For example, something that affects a very specific supply chain specific to your organization, rather than across the whole country. I've done my best to cover as many variables as possible in this presentation, but I think it's just worth noting that the way in which COVID-19 and the protocols that have been put in place around it are affecting us is very different depending on every organization, depending on the sector you're doing business in, your audience, all that kind of stuff is going to have a massive impact on that. And so, I've tried to cover as many different variables as I can, but I think it's worth saying there will be some elements where it might not apply to everyone, but we have got the ability to ask questions in the client, so hopefully you guys can see that in GoTo. So I'd absolutely encourage you to ask a question. I'll be doing a Q&A at the end. I don't feel like you need to hold on for to ask your question till then. Feel free to submit them throughout, and then I'll get to as many as I can at the end. And I would say any I don't get to in however much time is left at the end, I will make sure to come back to you on email. So if you do ask a question, I'll do my utmost to give you an answer. So with all that in mind, I'm going to get into the presentation proper. And the first thing I want to talk about is what we can do as digital marketers, and more specifically what we want to achieve in the current situation. And I'll kind of split that out into four elements. And then the first thing I'm really going to focus on is making the most of digital in the current situation. I think a lot of what we're seeing is that digital has become the primary mode of commerce in the current scenario. It's the primary way we're engaging with brands. I mean, for a lot of organizations that was already the case, but I think it's really refined that down, and that is now kind of our key method of interaction, not just on a commercial standpoint, but also socially and in our day-to-day lives. Digital has become more prominent than ever. The second thing I'm going to talk about is how we position ourselves for the sort of post-crisis situation. So if you look at some other countries where we're starting to see lockdown measures begin to ease, you are seeing a bit of a post-crisis upswing in the market. There's a bit of a trend that is being called revenge spending, where people who haven't been able to spend on the things they enjoy for a certain period of time, as that lockdown eases off, they can suddenly start to consume those products again. So we see an actual upswing in consumer interest. So just how we position ourselves for that potential spike. The third thing I'm going to talk about is essentially how we make the most of what could be seen as the negatives of this situation from a marketing perspective. Where some of the kind of situations that we find ourselves in really give us a low risk scenario for some activities we might want to undertake. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is how we add value for our users, customers, and prospects in the current climate, and what that needs to look like, and then kind of what the smart things to do around that would be. And so, yeah, the whole thing here, I'm going to be very focused on digital. I'm a digital marketer myself. I actually think digital is really well positioned to do well with the current sort of restrictions in place. So this will be a fully digitally focused presentation. So I just want to put a bit of focus on that. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is making the most of digital in the current climate, and I think I want to start by focusing on the idea that if you have a digital offering as an organization, now is the time to push it. And if you don't have a digital offering, now is the time to make one. Now is the time to adapt something to be digital, either digitally delivered purchasing or actually digitally delivered offerings or services, if that is possible in your organization. And really, I would say now is the time to be bold, because there is interest out there. We are seeing people engaging with more and more products, services, and content online than they probably ever have done before, because they can't interact with things in any other way. And I think the really important thing to bear in mind is anything you create or adapt now to be digital is not going to become deadwood once this all ends. Because really digital was already the direction of travel. And I guess what I'm starting to talk about here is really digital transformation. And what we're seeing is that a lot of organizations and businesses really weren't ready for the situation we find ourselves in. And a lot of the ones that are thriving are the ones that are actually quite prepared to already engage digitally with their audience, offer services digitally, take purchases through sort of digital platforms, that kind of thing. And so, if you're not one of those organizations and you weren't ready from a digital transformation perspective for this situation, then I would say that now is the time to start making change, because digital transformation has been a buzzword for at least the last year. I know I've heard a lot about it in the last year, and the reason so many people are talking about it is because it's not something that has happened. It's not been and gone. It's something that's happening. It's something that a lot of organizations are currently going through. And the thing about this current crisis that we find ourselves in is that will most likely have shone a spotlight on the elements of your organization and your offering that essentially aren't prepared for a digital future. And there's probably a lot of pain associated with that, and it's going to make things difficult. But it's also a lesson, it shows us the parts of what we're doing that aren't ready for fully digital interactions, that we need to potentially evolve and transform to make them more ready for the future. Because as I said, this was already the direction of travel. This was already the way most engagements were headed. And so if we can take steps now to become better at engaging in that way, then it's going to benefit us in the long term, because not only will it make you, more able to operate now, essentially, but more able to deal with the current climate, it's going to make you better prepared for the future, as I've just said. Anything that you make now, essentially, is not going to become useless in the future. And finally, it's going to make you more equipped for if we do end up in another situation like this, or any other kind of crisis that might affect the way in which you interact with your audience in a significant way. Digital, I think, is going to remain pretty safe throughout these kind of issues, or equally if you have any other communicative issues with your audience base. Digital is going to be the way that you can almost always rely on to communicate with people. And so a really good example of this, I work with an organization that do training, and essentially all their training centers have had to close, as we would expect. But the thing is, they are now making steps right now to transform all of their training offerings to be online training offerings. Now, this is something they as an organization knew that they needed to do. This is not kind of a new idea for them. It's just something that they haven't been able to put the resource into. There's a lot of pain and transfer change that needs to come with that. But they're making that change now, because if they can push that through in the next next 3 weeks, potentially, if this does roll on a little bit, then they'll immediately be able to start providing digital training to people, which means they'll be able to start taking revenue where they're not able to at the moment. And then, they have those online training offerings for the future. They don't stop being useful once this all ends. So I think that's just something to be really conscious of, is that digital transformation, if you can make steps now that are going to benefit you now, absolutely, they will continue to benefit you in the future as well. So the next thing I want to talk about is essentially preparing for our sort of comeback, preparing for when all this sort of ends, to whatever degree. We might see a gradual loosening of the lockdown, we might see something phase, we might see something that happens very suddenly. I mean, we'll have to see what comes down the track, but I think we all need to be ready for the fact that very, very quickly, most likely, we're going to see things shift. You're going to see customer interest switch back to maybe not business as usual, but something more like what we saw before. And just making sure that we're all prepared for that, and that things are in as good a position as possible so that we can all succeed in that situation. Because I imagine for a lot of us that this has been quite difficult, and then likely revenue, purchases, those kind of things are down, traffic to your site might be down. So how do we essentially prepare for when that all ticks back up, and how do we make the most of it at that point? And so the first thing as a digital marketer, I think is really important to be doing now in the current situation to prepare for that event, is SEO, because essentially whatever you're seeing currently, whether you're seeing a healthy search market or not, that interest is going to return if it's left, or potentially spike higher if it hasn't. Prospects are going to look for services again, even if they're not doing it now, and we really want to be there when they do that. And the reason I say that we need to be doing SEO now is because, one, it's very resource intensive. It requires a lot of graft. So if you have resource in your team that maybe has been taken off other things that they can't be doing currently from a marketing perspective, then refunneling that resource into SEO makes a lot of sense, because again, it takes time. Things like producing content, looking at redirects, that kind of stuff, it's all quite kind of manual and time-consuming tasks. So if you can get that stuff to happen now in this kind of dead period, if you will, then you're going to benefit from that in the future. And the reason you're going to benefit from that in the future is because SEO is a long game. When you start doing SEO and you start committing resource and effort to SEO, you don't see reward, if you will, in the first week, the first 2 weeks even. You're likely to start seeing those upticks in 3 weeks. You'll really start to feel the benefit of it maybe a month, 6 weeks after that. So if we think about the likely timeline of what's probably going to happen, if we start doing a really strong SEO project now, and we start driving resource and expertise into that now, then we'll be really well positioned to have a nice upswing in rankings when we're most likely to be looking at coming out of this lockdown, which is basically an ideal situation, because then as your consumer interest probably comes up, you're then going to be in a position to capitalize on that, because your search rankings will be in a better position to where they were before. Now that said, because obviously nothing is as it was in terms of the situation we find ourselves in, there are things I would say that you shouldn't be doing now from an SEO perspective. So the first thing, stuff that makes sense to do right now is technical audits of your site, looking at technical issues that are potentially affecting SEO performance. Link audit, looking at the kind of backlinks that are coming to your site, how you might want to affect that profile in the future. Updating your Google My Business page. I think this can't be overstated how important that is. Seeing it here, I actually wonder if that should be a separate slide, because if you think about how users interact with organizations and brands, and particularly where there is any kind of face-to-face interaction involved, or kind of an actual site or bricks and mortar element to the organization. Google My Business is now how a lot of people find those locations, how they understand when they're open, how they can get in touch with them, all that kind of stuff. So making sure that that's up to date for now is going to be really important, because that stops you from damaging trust with your consumer base. The position you don't want to be in, for example, is someone to search for your services, find your Google My Business listing, see out-of-date information about your opening hours, how they can get in touch with you, try and do that, and then find out that that's not actually accurate. That could really potentially create a bit of a bad experience for them. And I'll talk more about this in later on in the presentation, but I think it's really important to consider the situation that your consumers or your users find themselves in. And if you create bad experiences for them now, you don't want to be another problem for them in the current climate. You want to make things as easy and simple for them as possible. So keeping on top of your Google My Business listing, I think is a really important thing to be aware of in the current climate. And the last thing I would say is content creation. I'm going to talk again more in detail about content later on, because I think it's really important. But from an SEO perspective, creating really high quality topical content where it's relevant, and evergreen content. So what I mean by evergreen content is your product and service pages, those pages that will always be live on your site and always be organic landing pages. Working on those currently makes sense. And so I would definitely put a sort of crosshair on that as something that's worth committing resource to in the current climate. Things to avoid is keyword research, particularly around evergreen content, so particularly around stuff that you're always going to want to show for. The search market has absolutely been warped and changed by the situation we find ourselves in. Search is always just a reflection of what people are looking for, and that's not what they would have looked for before, at least not in the same volumes that we might have seen previously. So I wouldn't rely on any keyword data that you might see now around search trends to make decisions about how to structure your site, or what you should be saying, or the kinds of content you should be producing. I wouldn't do that research now, because those numbers and those data samples just won't be reflective of the norm, as it were. And the other thing I would say I wouldn't advise doing from an SEO perspective currently would be backlink acquisition. If we think about what our email inboxes look like now, you're probably getting a lot of relevant and useful information from brands and organizations that you're engaged with. And if you're in a B2B environment, you're probably getting a lot of internal communications that you really do need to be aware of and on top of. An email dropping into your inbox asking you for a backlink is probably the last thing you want to see currently. And again, it's probably just not going to create a positive sentiment towards you as the person reaching out. So I would probably recommend putting a pause on that kind of activity. What I would say is that we have the link audit in the left column. So getting a target list and understanding the kinds of links you want to go after in the future is absolutely a worthwhile piece of work, and something that can allow you to be really prepared for the future when you can eventually start actually doing that outreach again. But in terms of actually going out and chasing people for links right now, I don't think that's the right place to be. So that's kind of a top of funnel activity. SEO, we're trying to pull traffic in. So I think the other thing we want to think about is how we then convert that traffic. Again, if we do see an upswing in terms of opportunity, we want to be in a position to convert that traffic and those users and those prospects at as high a rate as possible. But what I would say again is now is not the time to rely on live data. So I'll talk more about that in a moment. But essentially, how I would suggest or advise doing CRO or conversion rate optimization now would be to act on best practice advice. So there are some things when it comes to conversion and user journeys and making things as efficient as possible that pretty much always hold true in almost all industries and sectors and types of website. I mean, there will always be outliers, but I think that there are certain things you can always rely on as steps to take. And the second thing I would say is to rely on expertise and heuristic review, whether that expertise is internal or third party, just making sure you've got someone involved who really understands the user journey and where those pain points are and how you can take steps to smooth those for the future. And finally, I would say make simple changes that are going to ease the user journey. I don't think now is the right time to restructure your product pages, for example, or make huge sweeping changes to your site structure in an attempt to optimize for conversion, because you're not going to have the data to make smart decisions about that at this time. So if I look at these and I think about an example of what this might be, we know, statistically speaking, and from experience and expertise as well, that generally the more fields you have in a form and the more complicated your forms are, the lower your conversion rate will be. A form with 9 fields is way less likely to get filled than a form with 6 fields. So now might be a really good time to take a look at the way you capture data and say, okay, can we reduce the number of fields that are in these forms? Do we need to be asking all these questions that we're asking? How do we record this data? Are we using all of it? You know, those kind of questions can now help you to think about how you might shorten those forms and therefore have a more efficient form for converting prospects in the future. Talking about conversion and transaction potentially, I think it's for a lot of organizations there has been a pause or a slow on paid activity. That's not the case for everyone. There are absolutely organizations out there that are flying and then potentially spending more than ever. But for those that aren't, and particularly if you've completely paused spend, I think now is a really smart time to draw a line in the sand, essentially, and take some learnings, because you have a finite sample. Essentially, if your campaigns are all paused, you're not adding more data, so you have a period of time for which you are live that you can look at as a whole, and try and get some understanding. So the kind of things I'd want to look at if I were in that scenario would be obviously what worked. What were your best performing ad copies, ad campaigns, channels? Was it social display? Was it search? What were the kind of creatives you were live with? What were they saying? What were the kinds of images you were using? And try and understand what elements of your paid campaigns were doing the most work. And the second thing I would say is look at what didn't work. Which channels were performing the worst? Were there keywords that have never driven a conversion? Were there certain landing pages on your site that haven't driven any transactions while others have? And then finally, what were you missing out on? Where did your competitors succeed and you didn't, because you weren't offering something that they were offering, or you weren't talking about it in the way that they were talking about? And then basically you want to collate all of that into some key takeaways about your paid activity that you've been running, and use that to optimize your activity for when you reactivate. So take these understandings, use them to make changes for your campaign, and then when you push it live, when we come out of lockdown, it'll be more efficient, more optimized. You'll be more angled towards the stuff that works and that has worked for your competitors. And that's a really good way to get things into as good a shape as possible for when either that upswing or that reactivation comes. So I've already talked a little bit about data, and as I said, I said I was going to talk about it later, and then here we are. We rely on data. A lot of my job is looking at data and trying to understand trends and budget splits and that kind of thing. So we rely on it, and it's a really important part of what we do. But right now, it can lead us astray. So we really need to consider what we're using data for. And this table is how I kind of tried to visualize this. Essentially, you have two types of data currently. You have sort of pre-COVID historic data, or what we might call data that illustrates the norm, and then you have data from now, which is mid-COVID lockdown, different way of living data. And I think the way we almost need to treat these is two completely separate samples, because if you're trying to analyze, for example, something that you've been running for the last 12 months, the data you have from mid-COVID, if you try and correlate that with the data you've seen before, more than likely you're not going to see much that makes sense. And really, if you're trying to analyze something you've been running for the majority of the last year, or maybe for the majority of 2019, looking at that historic data and cutting out all that mid-COVID data, it's going to give you a much more intelligent picture of what's happening than if you try and blend those two. And equally, if you're trying to optimize for right now, if you are running activity, or if you're thinking about starting to run activity, historic data is not necessarily going to give you an accurate picture of what will happen, or what is happening for your campaigns as they exist now, because market forces have changed massively. audiences are living their lives in a very different way. You may be doing business in a completely different way. So relying on historic data to tell you what's going to happen now is a bit of a flawed concept. Whereas you probably have a much smaller sample of mid-COVID data, but it's going to give you a much stronger idea of the reality of what's likely to happen in the next couple of weeks in terms of your campaigns and your activity. And equally, planning for the future. Planning for this kind of post-lockdown activity I'm talking about, I would again not lean too heavily on mid-COVID data for that. We might see a phased period where if we're in a 50-50 position, essentially, where we are locked down in some ways and not in others. But I expect that anything post-COVID from a sort of user behaviour and a market forces perspective is way more likely to look like what came before than it is to look like what's happening now. So I would say, if you're planning for the future, if you're forecasting, if you're trying to understand what kinds of activity you should be doing when this all sort of ends, I would lean much more heavily on historic data than I would lean on sort of current mid-COVID data. So the last thing I want to say about how to use this time to get ready for a potential post-lockdown upswing is that I think now's a really good time to upskill your organisation from a digital perspective. There are a lot of training providers that are providing online training courses, and then now's a really good time to take advantage of those. Because there are absolutely technical considerations with a lot of digital channels, but one thing that does make a big difference is the skill of the people doing the work. So if you can take steps to improve the skills within your team, you will likely improve the performance of those key tactics and channels that they have received training on. You may be able to develop some strategic understanding within the team from a digital perspective, where it doesn't exist now. The other thing is preparing for new digital opportunities, either right now or in the future. Some of the stuff I've talked about might not be stuff you've done before. So how do you get ready to do it right now? Well, get your team some training and get them up and running on these new types of activity that are going to benefit you during the lockdown and in this kind of digital future that's coming. And finally, it gives you the opportunity to push your organization in more technical areas. So some of the SEO stuff I've talked about might make sense to some people, might not make sense to others. And training in that area can be really beneficial, because it can equip your team with that sort of technical know-how that's going to allow you to succeed in some of those more technically challenging areas. And the final point, which I think is interesting, is that it's actually, according to government guidelines, furloughed employees should be encouraged to undertake training. When you see these slides, when you download them, I've provided the link to the guidelines if you want to have a look at the specifics around that. But I think that's just an interesting thing to consider. If you do have any marketing colleagues who are currently furloughed, that could be a really good time for them to look at some digital marketing training to help them upskill, and then they'll be more prepared if your organization does start to take some steps from a digital transformation perspective. So moving on now, I just want to talk a little bit about how to take advantage of reduced risk, or some things you can take advantage of reduced risk. And again, this is very dependent on the current situation you find your organization in. For some people, this isn't the situation at all. Your traffic is up, conversions are up, transactions are up. But if you are seeing some downturns in sort of digital performance, there's just a couple of things that I think are worth bearing in mind, that there's things you can use this time for to kind of, again, get yourself into a good situation for the future, and to take advantage of the fact that this otherwise potentially negative thing is currently occurring for your organization from a digital perspective. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is data cleansing. So I know probably we all would like to think that GDPR is kind of been and gone, but unfortunately that's not the way it works. Under GDPR, it's recommended that you cleanse your data at least once a year. And actually, if you have a lot of data, if you have a sort of large database, you should be doing it more often than that. But data cleansing is kind of one of those things that a lot of organizations just never quite get round to. And the reasons for that are multiple, but some that I just want to put some attention on. Is firstly, it's a really resource intensive task. Someone needs to sit down and apply a fairly significant amount of their time to going through that database and just making sure everything's compliant, and that you understand where all the data's come from, that all your opt-outs and unsubscribes have been treated correctly. all that kind of stuff takes time and resource. And so again, if you have members of your team that have potentially moved away from tasks they used to do because of restrictions, meaning that those lines of activity are not currently possible, then this is something that potentially you could redirect that resource into. The second thing I would say is that ongoing data capture actually makes this stuff more difficult, because you then have to draw a line through your database and say, well, we're not going to treat anything beyond this date, or if we are going to treat it, how are we going to treat it? And then you can end up with a bit of a disconnect between data that has been cleansed and data that hasn't. When you come to do your next round of data cleansing, things can get really messy. And so actually sometimes when organizations come to do a data cleanse, there's a pause in marketing activity required anyway. So if you are in a situation where you have had to pause some or all of your data collection, then you've already done one of the hard parts about having to do this task, because you've had to, essentially you've had to make that pause or that change. So you can take advantage of it essentially by doing this task that might have forced you to do that later on down the line anyway. And really, the thing with this kind of activity is it's just never the right time to do it. If you're live and you're out there pushing for conversions and pushing for data collection, it's never the right time to stop and sit down and really do a serious data cleanse that's going to keep you compliant. Well, I would say that actually, based on these factors, maybe now is the right time to do it if you're in this situation. And if you get it done now, you don't need to think about it for potentially another 12 months. It's not going to cause you any more problems down the line. So you might potentially not have to look at your database in a really serious way from a GDPR perspective for another 12, for the rest of the year till 2021. And I think that that could be a really positive place to be off the back of this. The second big thing that I think is worth considering is content consolidation. So when I'm talking about content consolidation, I'm talking about anything ranging from bringing a subdomain into your main domain, consolidating multiple subdomains into one, taking certain subdomains and pushing them into subdirectories, combining multiple websites into a single website, particularly challenging if you work in an international organization. All this stuff is really challenging, and the reason it's challenging is again, because you need to preserve your existing organic authority. You don't want to damage incoming traffic to your website. You need to maintain existing backlink profiles, so you need to make sure that the redirects element of the work is done correctly. And that, again, those two things are really difficult and really time consuming. And the third, and perhaps most important, is you want to avoid disruptions to the user experience. If you have prospects coming into your site, you want to avoid them having a bad or even just a different experience to the one that they're used to, because that could potentially reduce their chance to convert, or it might create a bit of a disconnected or sort of negative experience for them. So again, all of these problems are potentially alleviated if you are looking at a downturn in terms of performance, because you don't have as many users potentially to disrupt the experience of. So again, content consolidation is one of those things that tends to get put off because you just never really want to do it, because it's going to be painful, it's going to be resource intensive, and it could be detrimental to your user base. And a lot of those challenges that exist around this kind of activity have either been diminished or removed by this kind of situation. So ultimately, yes, it is a traffic risk if you do it at a normal point in time. So I would say if you have this kind of task on the back burner, do it now. Now is the time to act, because it will hurt a lot less than it will trying to do it in the future. So yeah, just a couple of things to think about from taking advantage of the current potential downturns that you might be experiencing. So the next thing I want to talk about is how we add value for users, customers, and prospects in the current situation. Now, I think I want to anchor a lot of this because as an agency, we always try and think about the user. We try and view the user as kind of central to what we're doing from a marketing perspective. So I would say that the way to think about this is the fact that, yes, we are living in different times, but we also need to understand that our audiences are living in very different times as well. And as a result, their needs will have changed. So some things you might want to think about when it comes to this is where are they likely to be based now, and is that different from where they would have been before? Whereas before they might have been out at work, are they now at home? Or actually based on where they work and the kind of sectors you engage with, are they more likely to be going out to a site? Whereas before their work hours might have been different. those kind of things are going to change where you're going to be able to reach them. And also, if you're looking at doing things like dynamic content optimization, where you show them content that's more related to where they're likely to be at certain times, that's going to have a really big effect on that. The second thing I would say is it's worth thinking about how their capacity has changed. So are they like to have more or less time for what you offer than before? If you're in a B2B space and the sector that you usually market to are all likely to be furloughed, then actually they're likely in a way to have less capacity for your services. Whereas if you are offering things that are kind of useful in the home, or sort of big comfort to parents who have kids at home, for example, actually their capacity for what you're offering is more likely to be much higher. So it's just something to consider. Because that might then influence how you talk to them and the kinds of messages you want to push out with. And finally, I think it's really important to think about how has what they expect from you likely to have changed, because their expectations of services is going to have transformed alongside their circumstances. So I'm going to talk a bit more about this in a second, but I think a really interesting one is if we think about takeaway food delivery, our expectation of how that's going to work very, very quickly changed. And I'll talk about how that has been responded to in a moment. One thing I would say, and obviously I know this is a trend that runs through the whole presentation, but this is going to be very, very different if you're in the B2C or B2B environment. Your audiences, because whether or not they're still working is going to be a massive factor in terms of how they're going to interact with your brand if you're on one side of that split or the other. So just really have a serious think about what that looks like. We tend to find as an agency that a lot of organizations find it very easy to look inwards and think about how situations have affected them, how their ways of doing business have changed. But it's actually a lot more challenging sometimes to turn those mirrors out and then have a think about how it's going to have affected your audience and how they're going to be behaving differently, and how that affects the way you need to communicate with them and the way they're going to interact with you in return. And so, I think it is a really, really good time to be providing content, and content, even if you can't provide any products or services in the current climate, providing quality content is still going to be a really, really good way to create good interactions with your audience that could serve you in good stead for the future. And so what I would say is, if you've been producing high quality content, either from an evergreen perspective or from a topical perspective, content that's really high value right now, then I would say keep doing that. I think it makes sense to keep rolling that out, even if you aren't actually able to transact. That's going to help you to build some reputation with your audience. It's going to help you to be in a better position when you come out the other side of this. Equally, if you are still transacting, you are still able to do business in the current scenario, then obviously you want to keep doing that stuff because you want to keep that audience engaged and understanding that you're still there and ready to provide them with what they need. And absolutely keep pushing out organic content, because again, organic content isn't really a right now thing. It's about building your search prospects for the future. So if you actually stop doing that now, it's not going to hurt you now, it's going to hurt you in a month's time, and that's the complete opposite of what you want. And finally, absolutely create topical and reactive content, but only do so if it's relevant. I would say, from my experience, I don't think the world needs any more blogs about how to work from home, for example. I think that's pretty saturated at this point. So just make sure that what you're saying is relevant and is going to be useful to your audience. And don't just be sort of adding something to the pile of stuff that's already out there that people have already seen 5 to 10 times, because they're just not going to interact with it. And even if they do, it's not going to be a particularly unique or memorable experience for them. In terms of doing topical content well, some things that I think is worth considering is, again, do you have anything relevant to say? I think I've probably just hammered that home, but I do really think that's an important consideration. I would say, are your audience likely to need specific advice or guidance related to your products and services? If you're offering products and services right now, what are the things your audience need to know about that? And how that's going to go. Is it going to go any differently to the way it would have gone normally for them? If so, what does that look like? And if it's not, and maybe maybe you think they would expect it would, why isn't it any different? I think making those kind of things really clear is going to be really beneficial right now. And that kind of comes on to this last point there. Have you been clear with your audience about your capabilities currently? Because you need to use all of these kinds of questions to influence the content you produce, because your audiences right now are going to want clarity of message, and they're going to want clarity of understanding around what is and isn't possible. If you, for example, have an e-commerce store and you're selling things on there, and you can buy and you can set a delivery date, you go through the whole checkout process, and you hit the end of that checkout process and it says this will be delivered once lockdown ends, which is an experience I've actually had in the last couple of weeks trying to order something. That's going to create a really negative sentiment with that user. Whereas if actually you tell the user in advance, yes, you can place an order, but you won't actually receive it until after this ends, then that's not going to cause a problem because they won't go through it with the wrong expectation. And so coming back to the fast food delivery example I was talking about earlier, if you look at Deliveroo, Deliveroo have made it really, really clear what that experience is going to look like in the current climate. If you go on their website, there's some really clear messaging and content about how that delivery process is going to work. And if you think back to a few weeks ago, or maybe even a month ago now, when this all started, there was a very sudden, very stark realization that a lot of those interactions couldn't look the way they used to. And so communicating that to their audience really, really clearly about how our drivers will behave, what you need to do, and how you should expect that transaction to go now compared to how it used to go, makes people way more comfortable when they come to make a purchase. And that's kind of the flip side, right? So instead of creating negative sentiment by essentially misleading, I don't particularly like the word misleading in that context because that suggests malice, whereas actually a lot of this stuff I think is just, no one's quite ready for the sort of degree of change that we're experiencing. But if you contrast that, that kind of bad experience of where my expectations haven't been properly set with a really positive experience where my expectations have been set really clearly and I understand what's going to happen, not only am I more comfortable making a purchase now, I'm actually more likely to trust the brand in the future compared to having the opposite feeling about the other brand that didn't make it clear to me what was going to happen. So I think all of that stuff is really, really important to keep in mind. And actually, if you take nothing else away from today, that last point on that bullet list there, I would say is the thing to be conscious of. Have you been clear about your audience, about your capabilities currently, and have you communicated that to them? And again, if you need to provide specific advice or guidance about what that means for them, I would absolutely encourage you to do that. And I think your audience will probably be very receptive to that kind of content. So I just wanted to do a really, really quick shameless plug about something we're doing currently that I'm really excited about. So we are currently offering training online. So if you do want to upskill any of your teams, or if you want to upskill yourself in digital marketing, we're providing a range of basic and bespoke courses, all delivered online. Our sort of teachers are digital marketing experts, so you'll be getting information direct from the source. So I myself will be teaching some of these courses, as well as a number of my colleagues. So if you are interested in upskilling your organization in the current climate and getting ready for the future, this is something that we're currently delivering, and I'm really excited about it. So I would absolutely encourage you to get in touch with us, and let's have a chat about what we can do to help you guys get ready for digital transformation of the future, or just transacting right now in the current environment. So that's my shameless plug over. I'm just now going to go on to wrapping up, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. So firstly, I just want to cover off essentially what the points we touched on today. So the first thing I want to say is right now is absolutely the right time to embrace digital, whether that is driving hard on your digital offerings that the digital offerings that you do currently have, or creating them where you don't currently have them. I think those are both smart things to do. If you whether you have or haven't started the kind of journey of digital transformation, I would say make steps on that journey now, because they're going to help you in the immediate term, and they're not going to hurt you in the long term. If anything, they'll just benefit you in the long term. And those kind of pain points that you're experiencing right now, where things aren't ready for digital and you suddenly need them to be, those are kind of spotlights that show you where you need to make change. And if you can change them now, great, because they'll work more efficiently. But if you can't, then absolutely think about how you can change them in the future, because again, this is the direction of travel. It's not going to go back from a digital perspective. So if you can make steps in that direction, I would absolutely encourage you to do so. The second thing I was talking about, just preparing for a comeback, and then again, One thing that I think is worth considering is if we think about the way we went into lockdown here in the UK, clarity was something I think that was in short supply in terms of when that was going to happen and the degree to which it was going to hit. And I think, we would hope that coming out of this on the other side, we will have a bit of a better idea of the timetable and the way in which that's going to work. That said, we might not. It might come very suddenly because the economic pressures may become more severe to the point where a decision is made more quickly than we perhaps were expecting. So, getting stuff ready now, even for something that might not happen for another 3 weeks, and making sure your house is in order from a digital perspective, either for right now if you're doing well, or for that point whenever that might come in the next 4 to 6 weeks, makes a lot of sense. And I think there are absolutely things you can do right now, even if you have paused all marketing spend and all marketing activity. There are steps you can take to make sure that you're in the best possible position to execute well when things come out the other side. The third thing we talked about was some ways to take advantage of reduced risk. And really, I think that the point here is that, if you have capacity that's not currently being used that used to be used on something else, or you have reduced traffic into the site or reduced transactions or conversions, then those essentially create a bit of a sweet spot where you can look at making some changes or doing some tasks that it's never quite time to do because of either internal or external pressures. So if you can take advantage of this potential lull to kind of get some stuff done that's always in the way and that you never want to get around to, and some of that can be really serious stuff like GDPR. It is. I've made light of it earlier, but it isn't a joke in terms of how ICO will treat uncleansed databases. So stuff like that I think is really worth taking seriously and thinking about doing right now, because something like that you can clear out and never have to worry about for a year. If you can get that done now, then that's a real positive. And finally, we talked about just the way we need to think about how we be what our users need us to be in the current situation. And then I think a lot of that comes back to something, if you've heard anyone at Coast Digital talk before, you've probably heard us say a lot of times, which is just making sure you're really focused on the user, what their needs are, what their requirements are, and particularly how those have changed, and how that's going to change the way that they perceive you and expect you to behave as an organization. And then finally, I'll just reiterate the point that I know I banged on about a bit at the end of that section, which is that I think clarity around what your capabilities are, what you can do, and how that's going to happen for your users and your customers, I think that's really, really valuable. And I think creating positive interactions with people where there is clarity and understanding of what's going to happen is going to serve you really, really well in the future, because it will create positive sentiment as opposed to creating negative sentiment if they don't get quite what they were expecting. So that's the end of the presentation. I'm just going to take a 2-minute break to have some water, and then I will dive into the questions that we've received. I'm going to run till about 3:30, so I'll just get through as many questions as I can. I'll aim to come back at just before 20 past and start working through those. If I don't get to your question in that sort of Q&A period, I will respond to you on email. So please submit your question if you do have one. And otherwise, thanks for your time, and I'll be back in a few minutes. Hi everyone, stuck around. I've got a couple of questions to go through, so I'm just going to tackle those now. So the first one is, how do you carry out a link audit? The first place I would probably start with that is look into, there are a number of free tools that can help you get a good view of what your link profile looks like and where any issues might exist. So I think Uber Suggest has a free tool that will allow you to do that. I know Ahrefs has some good functionality around that. I'm not 100% sure what their free offering looks like currently, or if they've moved to an entirely paid model now. But essentially, what you want to do with the link audit is you want to look at what are the backlinks to your site. Are they from good reputable sources? Are they relevant? You also want to look at things like, do you have any broken links? Is anything linking to like a page on your site that no longer exists? Do you have any sort of dodgy links, links from what we might call kind of suspicious websites? So things like stuff that used to be kind of very in trend maybe 5-10 years ago. Things like link repositories, I think is what they used to be called, where you could they would link to hundreds and hundreds of sites. A lot of that kind of stuff is viewed quite dimly by Google now. So just it's basically going through your link profile, just making sure everything is kind of as relevant and as sort of up to scratch as possible. And then, what you want to do is you want to identify the links that are really high quality, and obviously you want to preserve those. Then you'll have sort of lower quality links that do you want those linking to your site? And there are steps you can take if you want to potentially remove those, although increasingly Google's recommending against that, but in some cases it still can be the right thing to do. The other thing is, if you do have broken links, we generally recommend reaching out to the people that are linking to those dead pages on your site and just sort of offering them an alternative. As I was saying earlier, now is probably not the time to actually do that outreach piece, but it is a good time to kind of identify all of those potential issues and sort of make a plan maybe for how you will deal with it maybe later on this year. And it can be quite simple as an itemized list of saying, here are the link issues we've identified on the site. Here are the steps we're going to take to do them, and we'll start working through that list in, say, 2 months' time when things are a little bit more back to normal and our inboxes aren't kind of flooded with more high priority messages, and a request to change an out-of-date link is more likely to be well received. So hopefully that's helpful. If you have any other questions, sort of more detailed technical questions about link audits, just drop us an email and we can have a chat about that. So the other question I've got is about paid media budgets. The question is, if we are currently spending more than we normally do because of increased interest, what steps should we take to make sure we don't get cleared out of budget at the end of this? So I think that's a really interesting problem to have, and probably one that a lot of people would like to have. And if interest in your market is massively up and you're spending more than you were before, I think the first thing to consider is that building that reputation within your industry. If you are maybe one of, if you're spending more, that means there's more clicks or more interest, or just less competitors who are not chewing up any of your traffic that they might have done in the past. That kind of brand reputation that you're building right now might actually mean that you can continue to spend at a higher level off the back of this. So things might not sort of settle back to the level that they did before. What I would consider is just making sure you have some safeguards in place, that as things end, you don't suddenly end up in a situation where market forces shift really dramatically and all your budgets are still set at the level they are now when interest is higher, and you might end up overspending and then just not getting the return that you're getting currently. So just making sure that as we start to approach maybe the tail end of, maybe not next week, but the week after, I'll just increase the frequency with which you're monitoring your budgets, and just make sure that you're in the right position to essentially flip the switch and downscale if interest does start to drop out when we come out the other side. The situation you don't want to be in is kind of only checking in very irregularly, and then suddenly the market changes very dramatically, very quickly, and suddenly your return drops out. So I would just say upscale the rate at which you're checking in on that and that you're keeping an eye on that as we approach the likely end of this lockdown. And again, this stuff will all be easier if we get a really clear picture of what that timescale looks like. Whether or not we'll get that, is hard to say at this stage. I am hopeful that we'll get a clearer picture than we did on the way in, because there should be more time to plan and prepare. But again, I don't think we'll know for a few weeks what that exit or transition period is going to look like. But again, if we do have those kind of timelines where we can be really clear on when and to what degree normality will be restored, that makes it easier to make decisions about how we want to scale budgets into that period. And I think that's true whether it's an upscale or a downscaling exercise. I don't think in either case you want to just suddenly flick to where you were before. Day one of coming out of lockdown, spending what you were the day before we went in, if you were at a high point, is not necessarily going to make sense. So I think scaling up in that situation till you find the right point to be at in this kind of new normal makes a lot of sense. And equally, if you are flying high currently and you're going to have to bring your budgets down as we exit the lockdown, then again, I would recommend a sort of gradiated approach, because the normal after lockdown, where you've had this kind of high flying period where you're getting good traction and good interest in your brand, might not actually be the same level it was before. It could be higher if people are now more aware of you, they're more used to buying from you, they have a higher opinion of you. All that kind of stuff could actually result in you just having a naturally higher spend and a higher rate of return post-lockdown than you did beforehand. So I wouldn't automatically assume that the right thing to do is just flick the switch and go back to the way things were pre-COVID, because there could actually be some changes that have meant that isn't necessarily the case. So it's just be ready to be quite agile and quite dynamic with that. And yeah, just try and find the sweet spot for the new normal as we come out the other side. So I've got one more question. My voice is starting to get a bit croaky, so I'm gonna deal with that one on email. If you do have any other questions, please drop us an email or otherwise get in touch with us, and I'm more than happy to field them. But yeah, so thanks for your time, thanks for coming today, and yeah, stay safe, and we'll see you on the other side.